My name is Steve Winnick, and I'm the convener of the Music and Song section of the American Folklore Society. Yay! And that means that it's my happy duty to introduce the speaker at each year's Phillips Barry Lecture, and I'm very happy to do that this year. Our speaker is Alan Jabbour. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction. Alan is originally from Jacksonville, Florida, and attended the University of Miami and Duke University. And something I didn't know about Alan until I looked at his website, he was a violinist from the age of 7 and has actually been a member of both the Jacksonville Symphony and the Miami Symphony before he gave up all that crazy stuff for the more sensible folk music that he spent the rest of his life on. While he was a graduate student at Duke, he became very interested in folk music, and he went out and started collecting. And this became both a vocation, and he also became an apprentice to several fiddlers, including, most importantly, Henry Reed. And he collected the entire repertoire of Henry Reed, among others, and this ended up at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, which is where I have the happy distinction of working during the day. So that's my day job is tied up with Alan's work to a certain extent. And that collection is entirely online, and we encourage you to listen. You can listen to all of his playing and the collection that Alan has done. In April of 1974, he took a job at the National Endowment for the Arts, where he was the founding director of their grant-giving Folklife program, which has done so much for our discipline. And after that, well, before that, actually, he was the head of the archive of folk song at the Library of Congress. After the National Endowment for the Arts, he moved back to the Library of Congress in 1976 to be the director of the newly founded American Folklife Center. And he worked there for 23 years before he retired in 1999. Along the way, he edited some very important recordings of traditional music. He edited a long-playing record drawn from our earlier recordings in the archive, which was published in 1971 as American Fiddle Tunes, and that's now also been released on CD, and that's a very important document of some of the recordings that the archive has. He also did extensive research on the Hammonds family, which led to 3 LPs and ultimately a double CD. And since Alan will be talking about musicians that were influenced by Henry Reed, and since we're in Nashville, I should mention that the Grammy-winning bluegrass musician Tim O'Brien has recorded tunes he learned directly from the Hammonds family recording, so another area that Alan's collecting has been very important. After he retired, he resumed playing the fiddle more regularly and has worked on his fiddling as well as on other projects related to the fiddle. I should also say that in 2004 and 2005, he did research on North Carolina's Smoky Mountains on the cultural tradition of cemetery decoration, which I believe has developed into his and Karen's latest book, which is here on the table, and he'll mention that a little bit.
I won't mention it, but I'll just hold it up.
And finally, I'll just say that despite all of this introduction, he's a man who needs no introduction to this crowd. He is a past president of the American Folklore Society, a fellow of the American Folklore Society, and even a past president of the Fellows of the American Folklore Society, if you can believe all that. Just look at his ribbons. In 2003, he received the Benjamin Botkin Prize from the American Folklore Society for outstanding achievement in public folklore. With that, I will just say no more, and I will welcome our distinguished guest, Alan Jabbour.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you all for being here. So my title, as it shows up in the program, migrated as I started to write the paper. And so the current title, I say current because it might migrate some more, who knows, you know. But the current title is The Modern Old-Time Fiddle Revival, The Modern Old-Time Fiddle Revival. And I've entitled it that now in part to highlight the interesting contradiction between the terms modern and old time. The book Transforming Tradition, 1993, edited by our colleague Neil Rosenberg, Neil, where are you? Is he here at the meeting? I don't think I...
not able to come this year.
Sorry he's not able to. Anyway, it contains an introductory essay by Neil that is an important contribution to the published literature on cultural revivals. I also contributed a preface to that volume, which contains kernels of some ideas that I've developed here. In 2008, a considerably different version of this presentation served as my keynote at the North Atlantic Fiddle Convention in St. John's, Newfoundland. But as I say, it keeps migrating. Well, further. The English word revival, Neil Rosenberg pointed out, has been applied in cultural situations since the 17th century, and specifically to folk culture since the dawn of the 20th century. The term can be applied in a simple circumstance, as when a play is revived, or someone revives a fiddle tune from an old hillbilly 78 RPM record. Here the word is slightly metaphorical, since the play or fiddle tune never literally died to be later revived. It remained in a script or on a record somewhere, and perhaps in people's memories as well. But the sense is not complicated. The play or fiddle tune was previously performed, lay dormant for a period, and returns to active performance. In a more extended metaphorical usage, the earliest citation for which is by New England preacher Cotton Mather at the very beginning of the 18th century. Revival betokens a special effort to reawaken religious commitment, fervor, and devotion. This religious application of the term is very much alive today. Contemporary American Protestant churches schedule occasional revivals in addition to the regular schedule of church events. A church revival may recruit new members, but usually its goal is mainly to intensify a congregation's religious devotion and to reinvigorate religious practices neglected in the course of day-to-day life. Why is paper harder to separate as you get older? I don't understand that. A contemporary American use of the word revival refers not to reawakening culture amongst its existing adherents, but rather to the adoption of arts and cultural practices outside the source cultural group. This usage seems to have grown out of the mid-20th century American folk revival. And in this sense of the word, a white musician who imitates the style and repertory of older black bluesmen, or a New Englander who learns Appalachian fiddling, may be referred to as a revivalist. Revival and revivalist in this sense have stirred anger amongst some American musicians by suggesting that their art, which imitates or is inspired by certain folk genres, lacks authenticity compared to the art of people born into the source cultural group. This last meaning of revival leads me to offer a confession and a new term. In the 1970s, as the first director of the Folk Arts Program for the National Endowment for the Arts, I was in part responsible for spreading the use of the terms revival and revivalist to contrast with traditional. Faced with a limited amount of available funds and encountering people inspired by the American folk revival who found their way to the endowment's door, we began using revival and revivalist as contrastive terms to try to convey that we sought to give priority to long-standing forms of traditional arts maintained within traditional groups. But what seemed conceptually reasonable as a way of prioritizing proved deeply problematic in practice. In the early stages of the folk revival, it had seemed easy to distinguish newcomers from old-timers. At the Galax Fiddlers Convention in 1967, Karen and I were there, it was no problem telling local musicians from visitors reared outside the region. If you had recently moved from Midwest to Eastern Kentucky in 1970, your singing style probably didn't sound just like the locals. But what about 20 or 30 years later? Is one forever a revivalist after moving to a community, rearing a family there, and playing in local bands for a generation or two? Based on many interviews and conversations, I would say that local musicians themselves do not regard this distinction as important. This use of revival and revivalist with this meaning generated lasting antagonisms over the last 3 decades between public folklorists and many activists of the folk revival who should have been allies. For years, folk revival activists blamed academics for impugning the integrity or the authenticity of their artistic performances and creations. Ironically, the Academy was not really the source. We public folklorists set these terms into motions. Meanwhile, a new generation of academic folklore theorists were hammering out new conceptualizations of folklore based on small group creative communication, providing flexible alternatives to the older concept of folklore based on fixed ethnic, occupational, religious, or regional groups. The revival versus authentic dichotomy that we unfortunately unleashed actually missed the fresh new thinking in our own field about a more embracing and dynamic definition of folklore. Hence, by way of atonement, I offer a fresh term as a cautionary flag in assessing the relationship of individuals to cultural traditions. Of course, I don't know if anybody will adopt my offering here, but in the mid-20th century, a generation of literary critics embraced the term intentional fallacy as a reminder that an author's declared intention in creating a work is neither trustworthy nor all-encompassing as a guide to interpreting a literary work. A poem may mean what its author intended, but also things the author never thought of. Similarly, I propose origin fallacy as a cautionary reminder that a person's ethnicity, religion, place of origin, or other group membership is an untrustworthy measure of the authenticity of that person's artistic expression. The career of Cape Breton fiddler Jerry Holland, born and reared in Boston of non-Cape Breton parents, illustrates the dangers of the origin fallacy. Jerry Holland's recent passing was mourned throughout Cape Breton and wherever Cape Breton music is admired, and his impact on Cape Breton music has been profound. Assessing the term revival invites a few broader comments on the cultural process. We almost invariably see the past as more stable and unchanging, and the present as more dynamic and changing. Further, we imagine the movement from past to present as accelerating in the same direction. History is like a jet plane taking off, from stasis on the ground to climbing through the air. Though we know better intellectually, our mental models for culture and history tend to be straight-line models that fail to anticipate oscillation, cyclic patterns, or plain meandering. Further, we tend to think of groups as fixed entities, and we confuse group and culture in our discourse. Both groups and cultures are dynamic, not fixed. A group acquires new members when people marry into the group, move to where the group is concentrated, or otherwise join the group. It loses members by this same flow of human movements. Culture is even more changeable, reflecting a constant process of sorting new ideas and new cultural artifacts and integrating them into the repertory of an individual or group. Perhaps the inward-facing culture of the hearth is more conservative, and the outward-facing culture of the marketplace more open to new ideas and new cultural forms. But whether at the hearth or the marketplace, culture is interactive and dynamic, with cultural artifacts, genres, and stylistic ideas constantly flowing in and out of a community. Thus, it is not unreasonable to call culture itself intercultural. An intercultural flow is what we could call the natural state of culture, if I could use that expression. Finally, the process of cultural transmission through time often skips generations. Grandparent education is a classic form of this cultural oscillation, which may have the effect of causing cultural traditions to pass through troughs of inattention followed by peaks of renewed attention. Should we use the word revival to describe this ancient cultural pattern of grandparent education surviving a generational trough? If so, this kind of revival is not an external force affecting culture, it's part and parcel of the cultural process itself. When I recorded Oldtime Fiddlers in the mid-1960s in North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia, I worked primarily with fiddlers in their 70s and 80s. There seemed to be fewer fiddlers in their 50s and 60s, and they generally learned few tunes of the older repertory I was documenting from their elders. Among the generation in their 30s and 40s, the fiddle seemed almost a rarity, and the number seemed equally sparse for kids, teenagers, and young adults. Seeing these numbers made me pessimistic about the future of old-time fiddling in the Upland South. I brooded that older repertories and styles would perish quickly and forever. In the face of this assessment, I launched a documentary mission to preserve for future research these tunes and ways of playing, which seem to have been swept away by the tides of novelty promoted by radio and record companies, in short, by modernity. Two factors led me to depart from the documentary course I had set for myself. The first factor I can describe as animal spirits. The fiddlers, learning that I had played violin and was interested in fiddle tunes, treated me as if I were there not just to document, but to learn. This challenged my imagination. I began learning to play their tunes the way they played them. Though I thought I was salvaging a dying tradition, the animal spirits in me drove me to learn it anyway. The second factor was aesthetic. The tunes were beautiful to me, both in the abstract as melodic structures and in their sensuous surface. That is to say, the style of playing, the performance style of the tune. Our inner response to beauty is obsessive. A beautiful melody or performance demands your active imitation, whatever your documentary mission was when you started. So after I began learning old-time fiddling, I found a group of other young musicians to share it with. Bertram Levy, a Duke medical student, introduced me to Tommy Thompson and his wife, Bobby Thompson. The three of them had been playing music together in a style really more inclined to bluegrass. I began bringing to the Thompsons' house the tunes I was learning from my recording expeditions, and they learned the tunes from me. In the process, we invented an ensemble style. I mean, we didn't plan it or anything. It emerged, you might say. The fiddle playing the melodic lead, the five-string banjo played an adaptation of the melody an octave lower in the downstroke style, this way, not picking. The mandolin played a melodic line approximating the fiddle, and the guitar played a running bass line and chords. Unlike bluegrass musicians, we never took breaks, but instead developed an ensemble style heavily weighted to the melody and to the treble range, and repeated insistently with micro variations. The chords were usually of my own devising. My fiddle mentors rarely gave specific guidance for chording each tune, so we literally invented the chords. Of course, we met more musicians with each passing season, especially at regional old-time fiddlers conventions, so we were not clueless about approaches to chording fiddle tunes, but nobody at the fiddlers conventions but us was playing dozens of grand old fiddle tunes that became the hallmarks of our repertory. Our band needed a name to enter competitions at fiddlers conventions. The Thompsons' house was in the Hollow Rock community west of Durham, had been our gathering place, so we called ourselves the Hollow Rock String Band. A wider circle of musicians miraculously materialized at the Thompson house for jams and quickly learned our repertory. It rapidly became a music scene involving dozens of active musicians. Summer music and dance parties sometimes attracted 100 or more. We noticed that when we jammed in the parking lot during fiddlers conventions, we were starting to attract crowds. Wow, crowds. Happily, including both young and old folks. In the fall of '67, our band taped an album in a Durham studio. The long-playing disc came out in the spring of '68 on the Kanawha label. I think the company printed 500 copies. By then, I was finishing my dissertation and had accepted a job at UCLA in the fall. Bertram Levy was leaving to begin his Stanford medical residency. The old band was breaking up. But the music scene that had coalesced around the band would soon generate a new band, the Fuzzy Mountain String Band, whose recordings joined the Hollow Rock albums as early influences on the mushrooming old-time instrumental music revival. Then our banjo player, Tommy Thompson, developed yet another band, the Red Clay Ramblers, which became a fixture in Durham and Chapel Hill and around the country. Reflecting now on all this, I see that I was a participant observer in an American instrumental folk music revival that began more or less in the early 1960s and is still playing itself out in the 21st century. There's an extensive literature on the American folk song revival, which most observers date from the post-World War II era. I've argued it actually dates from the 1930s. That literature treats the instrumental folk music revival, if at all, only as a footnote. The revival that our Hollow Rock String Band helped launch largely ignored vocal music, concentrating on instrumental technique, style, and repertory. The repertory only slightly overlapped with the folk song revival repertory, Old Joe Clark and the like, and the entire social and cultural underpinning of the movement was different. Collective instrumental jams as opposed to sing-alongs rotating the leads systematically to each participant. I recall music parties in the 1970s that broke up into folk song gatherings on one house level and instrumental jams on another, a form of division which is is institutionalized by the American Folklore Societies, which has 2 rooms for jams, right? Folk song and instrumental music. We were not a footnote to the folk song revival. We were actually a kindred but different revival with strong links to the folk song revival. Here we might cite the New Lost City Ramblers, which really kind of straddle those 2 worlds, but also ties to bluegrass, ties to a parallel dance revival, and, like the folk song revival, important ties to collectors and academics. I've been calling our revival an instrumental folk music revival because not only the fiddle, but the banjo, guitar, mandolin, and other instruments received renewed attention from the 1960s on. But at its core, it's been a fiddle-led revival. Its repertoire, these are hard words for me to say as a fiddler, but I have to tell the truth here, you know. Its repertory has been mostly fiddle tunes, and the fiddle is consistently the lead instrument in the formal bands and the informal jams of the movement. Suddenly, fiddle players were everywhere. Where did they come from? Many had just taken up the fiddle. Only a few like me had studied violin as a youngster. It took another generation before trained violinists got seriously interested in traditional fiddling. That's now going on, but it's really a different stage. Almost all now here we come to the cameo middle section of my talk, where I look back over to make sure the fiddle is still in place, yes. Almost all my field recordings were in fiddlers' homes. One fiddler I visited, Taylor Kimball, lived along the Blue Ridge in southwestern Virginia. After I recorded him, he asked to hear it, and he seemed pleased and fascinated. A few months later, I went to see Taylor again. After we visited a while, he proposed making some music. I went to get my tape recorder from the car, and on my return, I was surprised to see another tape recorder sitting there already. Taylor said he had admired my tape recorder during my last visit, so he bought himself one. Now it was my turn to admire his tape recorder. It was a lot better than mine was, you know. So. After another few months, I visited Taylor again. He surprised me by playing a tune I had not heard him play before. Even more surprising, he played it in 3 parts, just like my fiddling mentor, Henry Reed, who lived a long way from Taylor's Blue Ridge home. When I asked Taylor what he called the tune, he said, Stony Point, the same title as Henry Reed's. Naturally, I asked him where he learned it from. Why, I learned it from you, Alan. He said, you played it for me the last time you were here, and I recorded it. I liked it, so I learned it. I met Taylor, oh, I should play you that tune. So here's Stony Point. I met Taylor Kimball, not long after his wife passed away. As a man in his 70s living alone, music became even more important in his life. Other young people, including some who had heard about him from me, came to visit, and he was happy to share his fiddle and banjo repertory. A few years later, he was invited to visit some young musicians in Maryland, and while he was there, he met a widow from the Blue Ridge named Stella Holliday, who played banjo. They had grown up 50 miles or so from each other, but had never met. But they took a liking to each other and fell to playing tunes together. When I next came to visit Taylor in Virginia, he seemed very excited. "Alan," he said, "go out yonder to the kitchen. I got a surprise for you." I went to the kitchen, and there was Stella, sitting in a chair by a kitchen table, positioned there presumably by Taylor. They were married. It's a measure of their joy that each of them learned the other's entire musical repertory in their few years, happy years together. My story illustrates how deeply intertwined the lives of us young musicians were with the elderly musicians we visited. Far from being detached observers, we found our lives deeply enmeshed with the life and art of the people we had come to observe. We were living proof of the observer effect, as it's sometimes called in the social sciences, inspired perhaps by the uncertainty principle of quantum physicist Werner Heisenberg, all you physicists out there. The principle of Heisenberg is that the act of observation always affects the object observed. So Heisenberg or no Heisenberg, the story of a cultural movement is not likely to be complete without recognizing the impact of its observers. Chief among the fiddlers who shaped my repertory and style was Henry Reed of Glen Lynn, Virginia, on the West Virginia border, who was in his 80s when I met him in the mid-60s and passed away in 1968. Henry Reed taught me one tune for which he could not recall the title. He learned it in his area from a fellow who had been down in Texas. When I got home, I learned the tune from my recording, then I taught it to my fellow band members. I told them that Henry Reed couldn't remember its name, but learned it from a fellow who had been down in Texas. That description of its source was promptly shortened, and the name of the tune became somehow Texas. Other young fiddlers learned it from us, and soon Texas was being played all over the region and beyond. Meantime, I visited Henry Reed a year or two later, and he happened to play this tune again. I asked him its name. Without hesitating, he said, "Newcastle." Explaining that Newcastle was the county seat of nearby Craig County, Virginia. So as I encountered people calling the tune Texas, I would politely explain that the real name is Newcastle. I even cheerfully took the blame for causing the confusion, but the correction was not always greeted with a full measure of enthusiasm. One young woman, being instructed on the proper title, looked a little defiant. As her eyes flashed, I realized she was thinking something akin to, "You can't take my Texas away from me." So sometimes the ways of tradition overwhelm your lone opposition, and you need to accept its authenticity. Even when it codifies a mistake you yourself set into motion. So here's Texas. Thank you. Maybe it is Newcastle. To complicate matters, I now play another Newcastle, which is what I dare call the Newcastle version of Newcastle. That is, Northern England has a Newcastle, which seems to have named itself after that county in Virginia. I don't know. And that Newcastle has its own fiddle tune, which I'm happy to play. And so, not long before the Hollow Rock String Band broke up, I taught band members a couple of tunes I had just learned. One was from Henry Reed and had no name. It was an interesting tune in G with a 19th century feel to it, lots of scales and arpeggios in it. The other was from an elderly fiddler in Martinsville, Virginia, Joe Anglin, who called it Lady of the Lake, a beautiful old minor tune in A, akin to Henry Reed's Ducks on the Pond, yet different enough to learn as a separate piece. Within a few weeks, I moved to Los Angeles to begin teaching at UCLA, and band member Bertram Levy moved to Palo Alto to begin his medical residency at Stanford. By the time I visited Bertram up in Palo Alto, Karen and I went up to visit him in December. I know you were, yes. He had already begun his Johnny Appleseed mission of seeding the West Coast with Henry Reed and other Appalachian fiddle tunes. His efforts had a significant impact on the budding revival of the fiddle in California. In the 1970s, he moved to Port Townsend, Washington, and in 1977, he created the Festival of American Folklife Fiddle Tunes, which continues to be a hugely influential festival on fiddling in America and beyond. Meanwhile, I had moved to Washington, D.C., and my life increasingly took me away from fiddling cross currents. But in the early 1990s, I played fiddle at a dance camp on Lake Coeur d'Alene in northern Idaho with my old friend Tommy Thompson. The dance camp went by the name Lady of the Lake. When I got there, the local sponsors asked me enthusiastically if I would play the tune Lady of the Lake. I was puzzled but obliging, so I played Joe Anglin's minor-sounding A tune from Virginia. My hosts could not conceal their disappointment. But they couldn't conjure up the melody they were hoping for, so the request languished in uncertainty. Tommy and I started working our way through our repertory of tunes from Henry Reed and other fiddlers. On the second or third day of the camp, by chance, we played that untitled 19th century-ish tune in G from Henry Reed. Our hosts leapt up in joy. "That's Lady of the Lake," they said. It seems that Bertram Levy, our West Coast Johnny Appleseed of Appalachian fiddle tunes, had mixed up the titles and called this tune Lady of the Lake. Now a whole dance camp on Lake Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, was named for the misnomer. By the late 1990s, I was playing the fiddle more again. When I played the same untitled Henry Reed tune in G, on a few occasions, someone would say, "Isn't that an old New England tune?" I'd reply, standing up for my mentor, "No, it's a Henry Reed tune from Virginia." I noticed that sometimes the person that I was talking to would give me a look as if to say, "Yeah, well, you say that, but I think I know better." Eventually, someone pointed out to me that Rodney and Randy Miller had recorded the tune under the title Lady of the Lake on their classic New England double album, New England Chestnuts. Since then, it has entered the repertory of contradance bands from coast to coast. Our colleague Gary Stanton, who also is not here, I'm afraid, tonight, has actually traced this tune's progress from Henry Reed to me, to Bertram Levy, who accidentally gave it the new name, to Marty Somberg, to Laurie Andrus, to Rodney Miller, and a new lease on life as a New England contradance tune. The title Lady of the Lake, by the way, originally names a dance, not a tune. And the title has attached itself historically to several different fiddle tunes, of which this is only the latest. So the story nicely illustrates really the fascinating byways of tradition when seen up close. So when I recently recorded the tune myself in a fiddle banjo duet with Ken Perlman, I cheerfully acceded to its new name, Lady of the Lake. Thank you. For a decade, I've been getting together with Henry Reed's family every Labor Day weekend. We play a lot of music featuring, of course, Henry Reed's large and distinctive repertory. At one such gathering a few years ago, one of his sons said to me, "Alan, play Rocking the Babies to Sleep." Puzzled, I said, "I don't know Rocking the Babies to Sleep." "What?" they said, "didn't Daddy teach it to you? He always used to play it for us kids." So they got their fiddles and taught me the tune. It's a beautiful, melancholy waltz, originally an Irish song. I loved it, and it's on my recent CD. Like other tunes, Rocking the Babies to Sleep is both venerable in origin and in its present version, unique really to Henry Reed as the modern day source. But I was not the first to publish it. A group of Shetland teenagers attending a Pennsylvania folk music camp where I was teaching learned Rocking the Babies from me. They put it on a CD they released, and it came out several months, almost a year earlier than my own CD releasing it. So the Shetlanders beat me to it. Maybe people will think I got it from them. I don't know. So they put it, the anecdote reveals something important about fiddling today. There's a tremendous amount of cultural cross-pollination. The Shetland fiddle revival is closely in touch with parallel movements in Scotland, Ireland, and the Southern Appalachians. Well, once through Rocking the Babies to Sleep. Thank you. I turn finally to a tune that has circled the globe. In the 1960s, I learned Over the Waterfall from Henry Reed and taught it to our circle of young musicians. The tune is related to the ballad, sometimes called Eggs and Marrow Bones, in which a woman tries to blind her husband and push him in the river, but is tripped and falls in herself. It is a venerable British tune, both as a song and as an instrumental tune. A 19th century English set of it that I saw in print calls it Girl with a Blue Dress On. It may be even older than that, Ian could tell me. But as a fiddle tune called Over the Waterfall, all modern versions stem from Henry Reed's version as adopted, adapted, and passed along by me. Our band loved the way the tune plummets down at the end of the first strain, as if over the waterfall. So we matched some nifty chords to it and began playing it regularly. It was already in circulation throughout the country when it appeared on our 1968 album, The Hollow Rock String Band, Traditional Dance Tunes. That I don't think is wholly responsible or even major responsibility for disseminating it. I think basically it just went out there. It was often used as an instructional tune in the 70s on the banjo, strum dulcimer, and hammer dulcimer, helping circulate it even more broadly, though its very popularity amongst novices led some advanced players to begin snubbing it as unfashionable. In 1981, Karen and I were invited to Hungary for a special bilateral round of events involving Hungarian and American folklorists. First came a conference in Budapest, then another conference in Kecskemét in southern Hungary, coinciding with a festival of the cultures of the Danube. By then, we had met a circle of young people who were going out to Hungarian villages, including ethnic Hungarian villages across the border in Romania, to document old-time Hungarian music, dance, and crafts. They were part of the Táncház movement, an important Hungarian folk music revival movement, featuring the fiddle, of course, I can't help mentioning. And in retrospect, they were a harbinger of the fall of the Iron Curtain a decade later in ways I can't explain now. We have other topics today. In Kecskemét, they invited us, Karen and I, to a late night party at the ceramics workshop. So the Hungarian fiddlers were playing and the schnapps was flowing. At a certain point in the party, a visiting band from Brittany began playing Breton music. Suddenly the word got out that the tall American played the fiddle. So the Breton fiddler came over and formally asked if I would like to play a tune. I agreed, and she turned and communicated with her band in a language I couldn't understand, but I could tell from the context that they were probably debating what tune in their repertory an American might know. Finally, she turned again to me and said brightly in English, "Do you know Over the Waterfall?" And so here's Over the Waterfall. All right, the interlude is over. The fiddle today is going through energetic revival movements in many regions. In the U.S., the Appalachian revival is matched by a New England revival. Farther west, there's a Missouri folk fiddle music, a fiddle movement, and there's a powerful contest fiddling style originating in Texas that swept across the western and central parts of the country. Various ethnics, as far east as Nashville, I might mention, that Texas style is sort of infiltrating Nashville gradually. Various ethnic styles have also flourished in the U.S. Irish fiddling has flourished both in Irish urban neighborhoods and with a wider, often non-Irish constituency throughout the country. Cajun and Zydeco fiddling in Louisiana have had a renaissance. Smaller traditions seem to have survived, revived, and thrived in the contemporary American environment. Canada is hosting several simultaneous folk fiddle revivals. The Cape Breton fiddle revival has become a powerful cultural movement with impacts going well beyond Cape Breton itself, including back in Scotland, where its cultural roots lie. Other parts of Atlantic Canada are also enjoying a surge of interest in their fiddle traditions. The Quebecois tradition is flourishing and may be spreading, and from the Ottawa Valley westward to the Pacific, various fiddle repertories and styles are reviving or flourishing. Across the Atlantic, the Irish fiddle revival remains strong, has institutional underpinnings, and reaches beyond Ireland to Britain, Europe, and especially the New World. The Scottish fiddling tradition seems strong and also has New World adherents. The Shetland revival has moved into its second and third generations since collector Tom Anderson launched it. And other areas like the Orkneys seem touched by the fiddle revival impulse. Elsewhere in Europe, from the Nordic countries to France to Hungary, we see signs of fiddle revival. Are they separate revivals, or are they all cousins in one great international fiddle revival? The last half of the 18th century bred a revolution in instrumental music and dance, a macro revival fueled both by the politically and socially revolutionary era and by the democratization of the Italian violin throughout Europe. That revolution expressed itself in various ethnic or regional forms, micro-revivals that became the older Scottish, Irish, English, Cape Breton, New England, Appalachian instrumental traditions that we know today. It may well be that the current revivals across North America and Europe are a similar macro-revival, within which one may observe various micro-revivals, each tinged by the cultural particulars of its ethnic or regional character. In this context, the modern old-time fiddling revival in the Upland South presents an interesting case. This vast region, tied together by early settlement patterns, stretches from the east of the Appalachians to west of the Ozarks. The region has a long history of exporting its musical creativity. The banjo, the minstrel stage, ragtime, blues, gospel music. Its fiddling tradition is quite varied, but in a number of features, it's a distinctive, broad region. Since the 1960s, the Upland South has seen a vigorous revival of older fiddle styles, for which the term old-time has been widely adopted. Old-time in its broadest sense, meaning in the old days or in an old-fashioned style, is a term widely and long used throughout the United States. In Southern music, the term found a new use after the post-World War II emergence of bluegrass as a new Upland South style. Where did I go? Appalachian fiddlers conventions began using old time as a technical category within banjo, fiddle, and band competitions. There were now separate old time and bluegrass categories sort of paralleling each other. Old time in this sense does not refer to the age of the performers. The term applies strictly to the musical style. Thus, when our Hollow Rock String Band competed in fiddlers' conventions in the 1960s, we entered in the old-time category. So did other young musicians playing in our general style. Perhaps this is how the new name for Upland South fiddling and string band music gradually became old-time, a ubiquitous term that covered more or less everything but bluegrass and country western. Bluegrass musicians play some old-time songs and instrumental tunes, but they have special requirements in style and repertory that distinguish their music from the broad old-time category. Just as Over the Waterfall and other Henry Reed tunes quickly spread around the country and abroad, the general old-time repertory and style began to take hold in other parts of the country. I myself resisted the trend toward calling it just old time, feeling that it wasn't fair. There could be old time Irish, there could be old time Cape Breton, old time New England. Southern music shouldn't aggrandize the term old time without qualification as if it were the only old time music. I preferred more descriptive regional compounds like Southern old-time music or Appalachian old-time music. But the best evidence that this is a strong and important cultural movement in the South is that there was a need felt for a name. Like the Henry Reed tunes that people now call Texas and Lady of the Lake, old time seems to be winning out as the name, despite my quixotic efforts, paradoxically, the only terminological competition is bluegrass, which is favored by some, especially in Europe and other faraway places, to describe Southern old-time and bluegrass string band music collectively. But the adherents of this Upland South instrumental music revival, the insiders, whether they live in the Appalachians or Seattle, never call it bluegrass. They call it old-time music. The magazine that best represents them is the Oldtime Herald, published in Durham, North Carolina, and presenting content that is overwhelmingly Southern in style, though as with bluegrass, jazz, blues, and other Southern exports, the artists may be from anywhere. Reading the Oldtime Herald, one gets a good sense of the dimensions of this powerful Southern revival movement. But professional folklorists, ethnomusicologists, and other cultural ethnographers have barely taken note of it. I sit by my phone waiting for it to ring, but it never rings. The lack of serious attention is not simply because the movement is modern. Other modern revival movements have received some attention. Perhaps it's in some part because we ourselves as folklorists have played so large a part in the movement. We've been more than participants. We've been more than observers, we've been more than participants. We've been actually major shapers of this revival. Further, like the many Southern musical movements that have preceded it, the modern old-time revival has spread beyond the region, around the country, and beyond. Most important, though it might have seemed in the 1960s and 70s like a musical fad of educated outsiders, it has now taken hold deeply with younger musicians in the home region as well as nationwide and abroad. One can now hear outstanding young fiddlers, banjo players, and string bands from the Appalachian region playing Henry Reed and Tommy Gerald tunes in an old-time style and self-identifying as performers of old-time music. So, some concluding thoughts. Number one, I numbered them to sound scientific. All the contemporary fiddle revivals need thorough and thoughtful documentation and analysis. Many of us have worried most about the older tradition bearers, but we must not neglect observing and documenting the younger generation, how they conserve and how they change the tradition they inherit will never be clearer than in the fullness of detail that the present can offer. Number two, documentation and analysis of fiddle revivals should not dwell exclusively on the biography of the movement. I hope my stories tonight suggest that the cultural chemistry of the movement is just as important. How tunes circulate, how styles are passed along, and how they are modified, how culture is transferred from the older to the younger generation and radiates around the country and the world. Number three, cultural revivals, that is, movements that revitalize cultural traditions, are so common as to argue for our considering them not a special phenomenon outside the normal rhythms of culture, but rather an integral part of the cultural process itself. Number four, cultural revival in the other sense, cultural transfer from one group to another, is also important to observe and analyze. Here we should remember that an abiding property of culture is its capacity to shift from group to group and to redefine cultural boundaries or group boundaries. A culture in revival is, almost by definition, in a sort of ascendancy of cultural energy that attracts others and leads to cultural transfer. Five, as we document cultural revivals, we should take note that we observers are part of what we document. Documentation is not simply a way of observing the cultural process, it has become an inextricable part of the cultural process. The documentarians are part of the revival as surely as the people toward whom the microphones and cameras are usually pointed. Number six, culture is nowhere more mysterious than in its timing. The Henry Reed fiddle repertory did not find a new lease on life in the modern old-time revival because of our clever marketing. Neither our little band nor our little record companies did much to disseminate the music we loved. We just learned it, played it, and away it went. The music was beautiful and the moment was right. Number seven, we're only going to 10, don't worry. Cultural movements have always been transcultural and transnational, so it's no surprise that the modern fiddle revivals have a transnational aspect. The greatest Irish fiddler in any given year might be in Sligo, Kerry, New York, Chicago, London. Tunes cross borders with astonishing alacrity, witness Over the Waterfall and Rocking the Babies to Sleep. Number eight, we should note how the power of fiddle revivals is institutionalized. The modern fiddle revival now has institutional forums like the annual Appalachian String Band Festival in West Virginia, known everywhere in the national network of old-time musicians as Clifftop. Bertram Levy's Festival of American Fiddle Tunes, universally known as Fiddle Tunes. The peripatetic North Atlantic Fiddle Convention, produced by our Aberdeen colleague Ian Russell, known as NAFCO, and magazines like the Oldtime Herald or Fiddler magazine. Number nine, we need to pay attention to the Upland South instrumental revival, which has radiated throughout the country and now boasts adherents throughout North America and in Europe. This is a major cultural phenomenon that we ourselves have had an important hand in. And number 10, as we analyze these cultural surges and ebbs, let's remember the dangers of the origin fallacy and embrace in our documentary and analytical purview anyone who draws a bow in that particular cultural style, no matter who her parents are or who or where he comes from. Thank you very much.
Now let's see if this other microphone is working. It is. And we're going to have questions, but I'm going to open with the first, one comment and one question. The comment is going to invoke one of our great mentors, I think, but will also start with a little story of my own. In the early 1990s, I was getting my start as a music journalist, and I was interviewing bands from all over the world. And one of the bands that I interviewed was a group called La Muscaña from Spain, and I was interviewing those guys about how they got started playing Spanish traditional music. They were from Castilla, and they said, well, you know, it was the 1970s, it was Madrid, so of course everybody was playing Irish music. It was just an assumption that I knew why that would be. And less than a year later, I was interviewing Varstina from Finland, and I was speaking to Kari Ryman, and I asked how they began playing Finnish music, and they said, well, it was the 1970s, it was Helsinki, so of course everyone was playing Irish music. And in both of these cases, what then happened was they played Irish music for a while, and then they realized, wait a minute, just like Ireland, we've got traditional musicians right on the borders of our town. Why don't we go out and collect and see what we can find? So the mentor I'm going to invoke is Archie Green, who talked about folk revivals quite a bit, and who came up with the idea that revivals almost always include both some kind of survival and some kind of arrival. And you talked about that a lot in the paper, but it's not only people who arrive, it's sometimes ideas, music from outside the culture, other things that can come and arrive and awaken people to what's going on and revive their own traditional music. So that's the comment. Now the question will invoke another of our mentors, and I don't know if you remember this, Alan, but I actually first met you at Kenny Goldstein's funeral in 1995. And so Kenny Goldstein is on my mind today as well. And one of the points that he made was that, first of all, a point that you also made in the paper, that in fact, you know, revival is a constantly occurring phenomenon, and then you can always trace back to an earlier folk revival because it's a natural part of culture. But one of the things that really interested Kenny was the technological aspects of the folk revival. And he always said that, you know, often changes in technology led to folk revivals, including the invention of movable type, for example. But certainly you trace the folk song revival to the 1930s, and I would say one of the reasons for that is the invention of the phonograph disc, which spread a lot of these songs further. And you also mentioned the tape recorder in your talk. So I wonder what you see as the role of technology in the fiddle revival that you've observed and been part of.
Well, regarding the first part of your comment, the Tanzhas people, when I asked them, you know, what inspired you to do the Tanzhas, said that they weren't in touch with Irish music or American anything at our level with the folk revival. They said rock and roll. You know, they listened to American rock and roll, inspired them musically, and then somehow led them back to thinking about their own roots and the exploration of their own cultural roots, and led to their cultural revival. You know, so, you know, who'd have thunk it, but rock and roll was in there doing its thing. You know, technology, I think, always affects culture, and if it's usable, the use of it inevitably has impacts in radiating things. A Hungarian colleague of mine read a wonderful Tamás Hofer. I don't know if anybody here knows Tamás Hofer. We ought to know our European colleagues better, guys, you know. Anyway, Tamás read a wonderful paper that I heard him read where he described a great efflorescence in the Renaissance of Hungarian fabric design that was brought about by certain technological changes in fabric and the weaving of fabric and so forth, and the technology in effect facilitated, it made it possible for people to do even more, and they took advantage of that possibility. Clearly, recordings are part and parcel of culture now. Documentation is part of the cultural process. Karen and I were just at a decoration in the high Balsam Mountains in western North Carolina. You know, it's hard to get more remote than where we were. And Karen brought her camera, of course, but she was by no means the only camera in the place. I mean, everybody else had cameras too, and they were photographing themselves just as we were photographing them. Therefore, the old question, will they be bothered by our documenting? It seems in a different context now because they're all documenting. They understand documentation as part of the cultural process. They're hip to that. They've adopted it. And yes, so I think hereafter, you know, each new innovation in documentation may lead to innovations in the cultural process that we ourselves can't forecast. Were you going to?
You mentioned the democratization of the fiddle, meaning the mass production of it.
That's true. Yeah, in a way that was a technological development because there were older fiddle-like instruments, you know, and, you know, we still have surviving fiddle-like instruments, the cigar box fiddle and so forth. But the older fiddle-like instruments were supplanted by this Italian violin, which was a technological advance, you know, and it was so superior that you couldn't leave it to the insider pros, and suddenly it got democratized by these manufactories that started cranking out fiddles so that every country squire and who knows who else could have one too, you know, and the democratization of the fiddle really is profoundly associated with a huge revolution in instrumental music in the last half of the 18th century, and in dance, by the way. The two are all tied to that technological advance.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed nowadays among the Irish musicians who are friends of mine is a shareware computer program called the Amazing Slow Downer, which takes an audio file and slows it down without dropping the pitch. Right. So you can hear the ornaments exactly as they're played, but at half the speed, and that makes it much easier to learn a tune that way. So that is another example of something that, you know, that's we wouldn't necessarily have foreseen 10 years ago, but that's.
When I was transcribing Henry Reed, I had the old tape recorders. I recorded at 7.5, but then I'd play back at 3 3/4, which drops at an octave, and so you had a groaning cello playing, you know, but actually you could hear the changes of the direction of the bow most of the time, listening to the groaning cello, you know. So that was our primitive solution to it, but there's sure amazing solutions to it now.
So now other questions, yeah.
About what your initial comments, what you were saying, what should be called revival movement now, it's almost 50 years after the so-called revival movement, something that I've been doing for many years in my research with New England Pakistan and the concept movement. And
Let them hear your question too.
one thing that my friends and Professor and I have been discussing is perhaps constructed tradition or invented tradition. So I wasn't thinking that. That's my question. My comment was, in the 90s I played in the Irish band of Hungarian people in Budapest.
Yeah, it's still going on.
So anyway, so my question is, what do you think of calling the revival movement, which is now 50 years old, a constructed tradition or a new tradition or invented tradition?
for the life of me, I can't see how it's different. It's different in ways that are technological. That is, it's national and beyond, and it's able to network using new technologies. And that's why all those people in Seattle as well as West Virginia know about Clifftop, you know. But that's just because they've got networking things at their disposal that enable them. But the essentials of culture, I'm reluctant. I started out life trying to give it a different name. And in a way, I'm expressing a little bit of a regret in that, because I think the more people examine it 50 more years from now, the more they'll see it as just one more cultural movement. In other words, I think we'll look more like a normal cultural movement than we seem to ourselves. We seem special and different, and we want a different name to describe our differentness, but maybe we're just sort of like it's always been, but of course in a different way.
So then you're saying we should document in detail. So instead of trying to rename things, should we just document it?
Well, I think documenting itself will lead you, it's led me to rethink things. And so the purpose of documentation, whatever we think we're doing when we document, finally the purpose is to enable us to examine and reflect on things with a broader perspective. And so maybe the perspective will lead you to use a term like invented tradition, but I'm not ready to apply that yet. I guess that's all I'm saying. I'm not hostile to it. I'm just not ready to jump in, having jumped in before and regretted it later, you know, right?
But it's kind of like the folklore thing, which sort of turned out to be, in retrospect, chivalrous. So
That's right. It sort of creates an artificial, it puts a construct on what should be sophisticated examination, and tempts everybody to relax and not be too sophisticated and just say, well, it's X or it's Y, you know. So yes, Marge, you're right. Yes.
I'm teaching a seminar on blackface minstrelsy right now, and the word whose meaning has proven most difficult to fix in that context is a word that you used several times tonight. The word is authenticity.
yeah.
Given your analysis of the very dynamic processual nature of the revival of fiddle music, what does authenticity mean to you?
I guess, speaking from an artistic point of view, I don't have full words to define authenticity, but I probably have gut reactions to it. And I find that I respond with a feeling of authenticity to all kinds of performances. And usually it's because they combine technological mastery and a kind of a creative aplomb that makes you think, wow, you know, they're doing something special there. If they're totally exactly imitating something else, I don't know how I would describe where I stop calling it imitative and start calling it authentic.
But it's a characteristic of the performance now.
That's right.
The origin.
I would say that right. That's right. It's the performance, and I can't say in a category now in advance, but I could say point by point as I hear the performance, wow, that sounds really authentic. You know? I suppose, yes.
I think that handheld mic needs to be switched on. I don't know if it's on. Is on now? Okay, good.
Thinking about what you're just saying. I mean, the embedded. I'm thinking about the embeddedness of the music. So if the performance, and I play old time music, and I'm from the Midwest, but I think I do semi-authentic music, but I don't if you think about the way the music's embedded in Southern culture, people who move to the South or who moved from the 60s on, who become locals, join local institutions, get embedded in local mores, and then they are no longer part of a revival generation. But people who take old-time music and are living further away and have music as part of this very broad array of other things they do, they might be very accomplished at that music. That does seem like it needs to be described as something different than someone who, because the South is a distinct region. There are still distinct regions in the country. So if the region and the music are embedded, then the people who are, if we separate the music out as something that can just be this global revival, which I think is an interesting thing. It also could be different in this, and still just as authentic, right? It could be all of them at the same time.
Well, I mean, when we talk about the South, I'm a Southerner. We talk about the South, it's this vast region, you know, it's about the size of Europe, you know, and it's enormously complex. And I grew up in an urban, deep South town, you know, so things from the Appalachians were, you know, just because I have a Southern accent doesn't mean that I'm okay, and they're, you know, I mean, I'm only as okay as I make myself when I go to the Appalachians, because that was not a region I grew up in. But it's Southern, you know, and it feels like there's a larger kinship, and they feel it with me too. But, you know, you're kin, but yet you're different, you know. And so you have to account for the complexity of this large, really macro region within the United States. You know, it's just enormously complex, and it's very hard to make casual generalizations about it that really hold up to. But if you're an old-time musician and you do it actively and perform it, well, now we get to the authenticity part. You know, that's where you earn your authenticity, not by being a Southerner, because you could be you know, as a Southerner, I can say that we've got plenty of numbskull Southerners that, you know, not only don't do it, but don't like it, and you know, don't care, you know. So the world is complicated. We got to remember that, you know, before we jump into too hasty admission to the club rhetoric, you know, either admission to the club or denial of admission to the club. And the old-time fiddlers I visited, you know, a lot of the people, including urban Southerners who heard about my mission to go visit old-timers, they said, well, now you got to be careful with those old people out in the country, you know. You don't know when you might have a shotgun aimed at you or something. I mean, all these stereotypes come out about, you know, the rural Southerner as dangerous person, you know, and fiddle, danger. It sounded like a natural match, you know. Well, that was baloney, you know. Of course, the fiddlers were thrilled that somebody cared, you know. I mean, maybe they liked me too personally, I hope so, but I think even if they didn't like me so much, they would have endured me because I cared, you know, and because they were so happy to have somebody who cared about their art.
Alan, I had an experience recently that ties into your talk, and that is I went to a fiddle contest at Lowell National, you know, it's a banjo and fiddle contest, and it's been in 30 years going on. And what blew me away is that the people that took all the prizes were young Berklee students, which is the Berklee School of Music in Boston. So there's this phenomena now. I mean, this is like the latest thing that I'm really confused by. These are very talented musicians, but it's almost a professionalization of old-time music, of bluegrass, that's being taught at Berklee. And it almost felt like it was akin to somebody being an actor and being able to act in all these different styles, sounding very authentic. I mean, they were fabulous musicians, but it made me, you know, a flashback to what you were talking about, being in the Deep South in the 60s and 70s, where you're living in a cultural context. This is a really different thing that's going on. And I see it as something new and rather confusing. I just
It's definitely a new phenomenon. And I used to grumble about how, like I could give a lecture in the English department of a university or in the history department or in the American studies, but the music school, no, that was another world. That's changing, and that's huge because this, as you were suggesting, this has consequences that, that are hard to forecast, and it may lead to, it's also leading to music teachers as a network getting interested in fiddling. The Suzuki method dabbled with folk music, but it was sort of more like, give me a tune and we'll teach them what we teach them, but give me a folk tune to do it with, But now, actually, there's a whole rising generation of young musicians who are tremendously skilled and tremendously open in their artistic appreciation to folk music. For the first time, there's a whole generation of trained musicians who are they're not just slumming. They love it, and they want to do it, and they do it well, but they do it in a special kind of well, which is different. So, pardon me? There is a parallel, yes, because the contest fiddling also created a kind of people got better and better at it because they kind of mastered it within their system of mastery, and it did create a kind of a special style that wasn't the old-time style at all, but in a way seemed to people like it must be because they were playing old-time tunes and so forth. So that's a good parallel, Cece. I agree with that. Yes, ma'am.
This morning we didn't.
Oh, Marge, go ahead. No, that's all right, and then I'll call the next lady.
Well, this morning I was in a session, I forget if you were there, on the politicization of music. And we were talking about the kind of institutionalization or professionalization of, so that there are now conservatoire environments in Scotland and England, one of them being, the degree program in folk music studies in Newcastle, and I know that there are similar courses in Scotland where music students get degrees in traditional music, traditional music performance, and also the whole contest thing. And then the BBC has even now the so-called Young Folk Awards or the Folk Awards.
Right.
And so this is proliferating.
Well, yes, that's all true, and I think we have to say, you can see the pattern. It did happen maybe earlier in the British Isles, but we can see it happening now in the U.S. as well. For those of you who don't know, Berklee School of Music is in Boston, and it's really an excellent school of music. Produces a lot of pros, but now they're producing a lot of pros, some of whom are doing folk music and doing it very well. Yeah, Matt Glazer is the key person there for that. Yes, ma'am.
We had a question here first.
Yeah, let's try to actually, this lady first, and I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I was really struck when you were describing the history of the transference of knowledge from your recordings and learning of Henry Reed's tunes into the living rooms and the kitchens in North Carolina of the friends that you attracted. What really struck me about it was its participatory nature, that this got started, that is, revivalism of this music, was able to proceed down the path that it's bringing us to today, because there was so much participation by everyday people. And to me, that's a really important gem that I think I want to take away from what you said. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit more about the widespread nature of this kind of participation in a music that doesn't require, you know, stars in bluegrass or stars who are technically trained, but people who are just simply drawn to the beauty of the music and want to learn it.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know if I'm getting at what you're getting at, but what it makes me think about is this, that one of the really attractive cultural features of the Southern instrumental music scene as I encountered it in the 60s, that really, Karen did a lot of this with me, as we encountered it in the 60s, is that the world I had grown up in, you know, had mastery up here and kind of, you know, in snobby endurance of people short of that in the middle, and then nothing below that, you know. Whereas this was a world where you had plateaus of mastery. You could end up as a fiddler playing a kind of a simple style, but you could play for your own satisfaction very well, and for the satisfaction of others. And then there might be in the same community people who were a notch more complex in their style, you know, and people like that too, but one didn't preclude the other. And some of the simple musicians were very beautiful musicians and did beautiful music. So it was, in that way, it was a very democratic milieu, you might say, for the art. The art permitted the individual to sort of kick out at the plateau of their competence and to do something beautiful.
What I really wanted to get at is that it almost feels like maybe this music would not have been able to spread had it not, and when it died out with the Henry Reeds, and you had not gone to collecting the tunes, and if you hadn't shared it with your friends, and your friends had not responded to it, it would not have happened without everyday people responding to what you found and what other people and when it died out, because there wasn't the participation, it was just a lonely fiddler.
That's a very true statement, and I wish I knew why that happened. But it's true that it happened very personally and interpersonally. It didn't happen by a program that was somebody didn't institute a program, you know, and carry it out in the four corners, you know. In fact, it was naive, but it was full of love and energy, and the time was right, and who knows what other factors made it work, you know, but it worked.
I think we'll take our last question in the back, the person who wanted to ask before. Yeah.
Hi, I don't know if you remember me. I was playing with you last year.
Yes, hi, how are you?
Yeah.
Oh, you play harp.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
right. Yes. No, I just wanted to pick up on what this lady said, and also Marge in the front about, you know, these sort of schools, because in Scotland we have these trad degrees and various other sort of schools of almost like excellence, if you like, in traditional music. And it just kind of sometimes feels that it is almost, you know, the standard is so high, and it's kind of like a conveyor belt, and they're churning them out, and it's almost making the music a little bit inaccessible for people who would normally play trad music with no problem whatsoever. You know what I mean? It's kind of just, it's kind of taken it almost out of the arena of everybody. I just worry about that a little.
Well, in a way, that's
what you're saying, yeah?
What others were worrying about too, because it may be a good thing or a bad thing, but
Yeah.
it's a different thing, you know,
It is.
and we need to kind of recognize what's going on there.
In ethnomusicology, we sometimes distinguish between presentational and participatory music. What Maggie was talking about, what's going on in Berkeley, the context is presentational music from stage. Participatory music, jam is something democratic. You're talking about maybe one of the reasons part of it is talking about how to spread it now. Not that it wouldn't spread the other way, but in a different sense. But one other comment, when I was first listening to Tommy Jarrell's Fiddle album, solo Fiddle album, I was struck by how he introduced almost every tune with a reference to some other musician in his community who had played the tune or with whom the tune was identified. And it made me think about what is a tune? It was for Tommy Jarrell, at any rate, not just something to be played from the stage and presented, but it connected him with other people in his community through generations. And so you couldn't really say
That's great.
it was a piece of music that you could represent simply on a piece of paper or a recording or something, but it was alive in the community and acted
That's great.
you're describing the process like that.
Oh, that's really good, and that goes to the point you were making, you know. So then, you know, it's not just a tune, it's an artistic message from somebody to you that you're then passing to the next person, you know. And
I see Barry wants to add something as well.
The comments you made about the in-person thing, it's wonderful that happened. But I often think, I'm reminded that there probably were lots of other Henry Reeds that somebody didn't run into, who may have died 5 years earlier, or, you know. So we know about those great ones, the Dennis McGee's, and the Henry Reeds, and the Tom Jarrells. There are others who we didn't meet, we didn't know, and a lot of us. I mean, I was one Saturday morning awakened by a little lady who called me up to my house and said, I saw your show on TV. I saw you singing a song with no instruments. You like those songs? I said, yes, ma'am. She said, well, you want to hear some? I said, sure. She said, well, come to my house. I'll sing you some. And I'm thinking, here, I've been looking for these things for 30 or 40 years. I said, where do you live? And she said, right here next to you in Scott. I thought, oh my God. You know,
that's a great
we're
story.
looking for the ones we find, and there's even more.
Yeah, Herbert Halpern, collected all these great stories about a fiddler in the Pine Barrens named Sammy Jefferson, whom we have no tunes from because he died before anyone recorded him. But people still were talking about him a generation later when Dr. Halpern was there. So.
On that note, one of the great fiddlers of South Louisiana Cajun music tradition is Baskin Mouton. Everybody south of I-10 refers to Baskin Mouton. He's such a, and he never recorded. Alan Womack, he went to Jimmy's, and Alan Womack was recording in 1934, and asked how much he was paying, and Alan said, I'm not paying anything, I'm working for the Library of Congress, and never mind, left. That would have been the only recording.
Oh my gosh.
And he didn't do it. But I was talking to the Connor family, Larry's Connor, and he said, that's too bad. It's too bad we don't have any recordings of Baskin Mouton. It would have been so great to hear that guy that everybody keeps referring to. And one of the kids said, you want some? What? He said, yeah, we've got a tape recorder. We recorded a bunch of stuff when he came to play with Pop. So sometimes